The year 1863 found Louisiana at the intersection of war and transformation, its land soaked with the sweat of labor and the blood of armies. The Union's ironclads prowled the Mississippi, and the Confederacy's hold on the western river parishes began to fracture. In the cane fields that lined the river's slow brown curves, thousands of enslaved men and women lived suspended between bondage and uncertain freedom. They heard rumors carried by drifting soldiers and by the wind, stories that the Union Army had crossed into Baton Rouge, that Abraham Lincoln had signed something called the Emancipation Proclamation, that the old world was trembling. But in the parishes south of New Orleans, life on the plantations went on as it always had, the sugar mills grinding, the overseers shouting, the slaves laboring from dawn until exhaustion. The great houses stood white and defiant above the bayous, their verandas lit by lamps that burned whale oil and arrogance. To understand what happened that summer, one must understand the geography of fear and hope that defined southern Louisiana. The swamps were both prison and promise, endless labyrinths of cypress and water, where snakes coiled like ropes and mosquitoes rose in clouds thick enough to choke a mule. The white planters called them cursed places, good only for hunting and hiding runaways, but for those who had nothing left to lose, the swamps were sanctuaries, alive with the memory of freedom. Since the days of the French and Spanish colonies, men and women who had escaped the plantations had built secret maroon communities deep within those wetlands, small encampments of brush huts raised above the water, invisible from the roads, sustained by stolen corn, wild game, and the fierce belief that a life in mud was still better than a life in chains. By 1863, such communities were multiplying again, feeding on the chaos of war. Union incursions along the river weakened patrols, and plantation defenses grew thin. Some planters fled inland. Others armed their slaves and forced them to guard their own oppressors' property. Within that unstable landscape, one figure began to stand out, a field driver on a large sugar estate near the town of Thibodaux, known among the enslaved simply as the preacher. His given name has been lost to history, preserved only in scattered accounts from planters' diaries and post-war testimony recorded by the Freedmen's Bureau. But the fragments suggest a man of uncommon presence, tall, spare, dark-skinned, with eyes that seemed to see through the world around him. He had once been hired out to work on riverboats and had traveled as far north as Vicksburg before being sold back south. Somewhere along the way he had learned to read, at least a little, and had memorized long passages of scripture that he recited in the quarters on Sundays when the overseers were drunk, the preachers. Faith was not the docile Christianity that masters approved of, the kind that preached patience and heavenly reward. His sermons were filled with fire and judgment. He spoke of Moses and Pharaoh, of Babylon's fall, of God's wrath against injustice. "The river shall open and the chains shall fall," one witness recalled him saying years later. His words stirred both hope and dread. To the enslaved, he was a prophet. To the overseers, a troublemaker whose voice carried too far into the night. Still, the master, an aging planter named Armand Dupré, tolerated him for practical reasons. The preacher's influence kept the younger men working when the threat of the whip no longer sufficed. By early 1863, Dupré's plantation was struggling. The war had drained manpower and markets alike. Confederate impressment officers had seized his best horses and most of his sons for service. Union gunboats on the river made transport dangerous. The fields went untended. Food grew scarce. Amid that decline, the preacher's quiet defiance ripened. He began to speak less of heaven and more of the present world, of the armies moving south, of the chance that the end of slavery was nearer than anyone dared believe. He was seen walking the ditches at dusk, speaking to small groups of field hands in low tones, pointing toward the distant tree line where the swamp began. No one knew exactly when talk became conspiracy, only that it spread quickly, carried by those who had learned to listen without being seen. The catalyst came in May, when word reached the plantation that the Union Army had captured Port Hudson, cutting off Confederate control of the lower Mississippi. For the first time, the enslaved population of Louisiana could glimpse freedom advancing from the north like a tide. Planters panicked, moving valuables inland, chaining suspected agitators and tightening patrols. But the preacher saw opportunity. If the Union was coming, he reasoned, they could meet it halfway. There were hundreds of enslaved men in the region who knew the terrain better than any soldier. They had axes, machetes, fire, and the element of surprise. They could strike, seize weapons, and flee into the swamps, forming a living bridge between bondage and freedom. Historians have long debated whether what followed was a planned revolt or a spontaneous eruption. The surviving records are sparse: a few plantation letters, a Confederate report lamenting disloyal Negroes near the bayou, and fragments of oral history collected decades later. But all agree on the night itself. It came in late June after weeks of torrential rain. The cane fields were slick with mud, the air heavy with thunder. Just after midnight, flames rose from the Dupré sugar house, followed by the sound of gunfire. Within minutes, fire spread to the stables, the smoke turning the sky a hellish red. Slaves from neighboring plantations, drawn by the light, took up tools and torches. White overseers fled or were cut down in the confusion. Horses bolted into the dark. By dawn, 3 plantations along Bayou La Fourche lay in ruins. The main houses had been looted and burned, cane rows trampled, fences broken. Survivors spoke of a group of 20 or 30 men leading the attack, moving with precision, calling others to join them. At their head was the preacher, his shirt torn, a rifle in his hand, his voice rising above the chaos, shouting words that no one later dared repeat. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the revolt vanished into the Cypress shadows. Confederate patrols sent to crush it found nothing but footprints leading into the wetlands and the charred remains of the Dupré estate. For days, the region descended into panic. Rumors spread that hundreds of armed slaves were gathering in the swamps, that they planned to march on Thibodaux or even New Orleans. Militia companies scoured the bayous, firing into the reeds at phantoms. Dozens of enslaved men were seized, tortured, and executed. Yet no organized army emerged from the swamps, no preacher was captured, no body found. The revolt dissolved into legend as quickly as it had flared. In planter correspondence, the event was downplayed as a disturbance by a few misguided Negroes, a deliberate erasure meant to calm investors and avoid panic. But among the freed people after the war, the story lived on, reshaped by retelling. How one of their own had lit the fires of freedom and then walked into the swamp, never to be seen again. Modern historians, combing through military dispatches and census records, have found traces that suggest the legend's foundations are real. In July 1863, Union forces advancing from Baton Rouge recorded meeting bands of runaways along the bayous, groups of men and women armed with crude weapons who claimed to have escaped a battle at a plantation to the south. Some of these groups joined the Union ranks as laborers or scouts. Others disappeared back into the swamps, distrustful of any uniform. One Union officer noted in his diary that a black man calling himself Eli guided them for several days through the flooded marshes, then vanished one morning without a trace. Whether Eli was the preacher or another fugitive will never be known. What is certain is that the revolt of 1863, however small or brief, marked a turning point in the psychology of slavery in Louisiana. For centuries, the plantation system had relied not only on chains but on despair, the belief that resistance was futile, that the swamp would swallow any who dared flee. Yet the preacher's rebellion, even in its failure, shattered that myth. It showed that the enslaved were not waiting passively for freedom to be handed down from Washington or delivered by armies. They were seizing it with their own hands, however bloody or uncertain the outcome by autumn. When Union troops finally secured the lower Mississippi, many of the plantations along Bayou La Fourche stood abandoned. The cane fields had gone to seed, the houses empty. Soldiers spoke of smoke still rising from the marshes, of voices singing hymns deep within the cypress groves. Some believed they had found the maroon camp, half hidden by reeds, but when they approached, they found only ashes and footprints leading deeper into the water. It was as if the land itself had swallowed the memory of those who refused to bow, The morning after the fires, the sky over Bayou La Fourche was gray with ash and silence. The rain that had been falling for days finally ceased, leaving the air heavy and strange as though the land itself were holding its breath. The plantations that had stood as symbols of Southern permanence were reduced to blackened skeletons, their white columns streaked with soot, their roofs sagging into the wet earth. The burned-out shells of sugar houses still smoked faintly, a bitter scent mingling with the sweet rot of cane. Crows circled overhead, their cries echoing down the ruined rows. Word traveled fast along the bayou. 3 plantations torched, overseers killed, dozens of slaves missing. For the planters who survived, the shock was total. They had believed themselves insulated from the chaos of war, protected by the hierarchy of their world. Overnight, that illusion crumbled. Within 24 hours, militia patrols were moving along the waterways. Colonel Baptiste Chenevert, a veteran of the Mexican War and now commander of the local Confederate Guard, issued orders for all Negroes found off property to be detained or shot. The men he led were planters, overseers, and conscripted farmers, angry, frightened men whose livelihoods were built on obedience. They moved through the wetland with dogs and torches, firing into the thickets at shadows, dragging fugitives from the cane fields, questioning them under the threat of the lash. Many of the captured were beaten into confessing names or places, but most knew nothing. The preacher's followers had vanished too completely, their trail swallowed by the mud and mist. The newspapers that still circulated in Confederate Louisiana printed brief reports, careful not to alarm readers. Negro insurrection in Lafourche Parish, one line read in the New Orleans Bee, promptly suppressed by local citizens. There was no mention of burned estates, nor of the bodies found half buried in the marsh. The planters preferred to tell themselves it had been an isolated flare of madness, sparked by Yankee rumors. Yet privately, letters between families betrayed a deeper fear, that the rebellion was not over, merely hidden. "They are still out there," one planter wrote to his cousin in Ascension Parish, "waiting for the next chance, waiting for the next army to come." The swamps themselves became a living character in this unfolding tragedy, vast, unknowable, and ungovernable. The Atchafalaya Basin and its satellite bayous stretched across southern Louisiana like an inland sea, a world of moss and mist that even the native Cajuns feared to enter at night. For the enslaved, those waters represented both death and deliverance. Maroon camps had existed there for generations, some dating back to the 1700s. They were built on raised hummocks, hidden behind curtains of cypress and Spanish moss, reachable only by narrow pirogues that slipped silently through the channels. These Maroons hunted, fished, and traded secretly with sympathetic free people of color from the nearby parishes. Some had intermarried with the remnants of native tribes, the Kitimaca, the Atacapa, creating a hidden world of survival at the edge of civilization. It was into this wilderness that the preacher and his companions disappeared. Contemporary accounts from Confederate patrols described the swamps as impossible terrain. Horses sank in the mire, muskets rusted, torches sputtered out in the humidity, men returned from days of searching with fever, leeches clinging to their legs, their nerves shattered by the constant noise of insects and the haunting cries of unseen animals. It was as though the devil himself lived there, one soldier wrote. You could hear them, the runaways, singing in the dark, but you could not find them. When the rains came again, the search ended, the patrols withdrew, and the parish authorities declared the rebellion extinguished. But in the months that followed, strange signs appeared along the bayou. Smoke rising from deep within the swamp at odd hours, livestock missing from isolated farms, a skiff found adrift, its oars gone, its boards marked by machete cuts. Rumors spread of the preacher's camp, said to be a place where escaped slaves gathered to plan further attacks. Some claimed to have heard drums echoing through the cypress stands at night, a slow rhythm that carried for miles. Others whispered that the preacher was dead, his body sunk beneath the waters, and that the sounds were his restless spirit. For the enslaved who remained on nearby plantations, those rumors were both terrifying and liberating. Even in defeat, the revolt had broken something fundamental, the sense of helplessness that generations of cruelty had instilled. Overseers noticed that the people in the quarters spoke more quietly, worked more deliberately, their eyes no longer blank but watchful. They sang different songs now, ones that the whites could not understand, and songs of water, of trees, of escape. The preacher's name was never spoken aloud, yet his story traveled invisibly from camp to camp, carried by whispers and fragments of memory. Meanwhile, the larger war pressed closer. Union troops advancing south along the Mississippi began to liberate plantations as they went. Thousands of former slaves followed the armies, forming contraband camps, makeshift refugee settlements along the riverbanks where disease and hunger competed with hope. In New Orleans, now under Union control, black men were being recruited into the Louisiana Native Guard, the first African-American regiment to fight officially for the United States. For those still enslaved in the countryside, these developments seemed almost mythical, distant as stars. But the preacher's revolt, small though it was, had cracked open the door of belief. By autumn of 1863, as Confederate power waned, Louisiana was a land of divided loyalties and blurred identities. Patrols of Confederate cavalry roamed by day, while by night the swamps and woods belonged to deserters, maroons, and guerrillas. Plantations that had once been the engines of wealth now stood half abandoned, their labor force depleted by escape or enlistment. Among the planters, paranoia became a way of life. They slept with pistols under their pillows, posted guards at their gates, and demanded daily reports from their drivers. Every rustle in the cane, every bark of a dog, every flicker of light in the distance was a possible sign of rebellion. In the city, Union officers recorded their own version of the events along Bayou La Fourche. Some treated the uprising as evidence of spontaneous Negro patriotism, proof that the enslaved people were eager to fight for their freedom. Others dismissed it as banditry, yet in private correspondence a few officers seemed awed by what they heard from the refugees who reached their lines. They spoke of a man who preached fire and deliverance, one wrote. He told them to burn what had enslaved them, to flee into the water and wait for the Lord's army. They said he could vanish like smoke. We searched for him too, but he was nowhere to be found. As weeks turned into months, the preacher's legend began to grow. Among freedmen's gatherings along the river, stories were told of how he had been seen leading runaways through the marsh under the light of the moon, his voice singing hymns that made the waters part. Some said he had joined the Union forces under another name. Others believed he had crossed into Texas to stir more revolts. In each retelling, he became less a man than a symbol, the spirit of resistance itself, born from the swamps that had swallowed so many lives. The planters, however, were determined to erase him. In court records from the parish seat of Thibodaux, there are references to agitators of colored persuasion, whose names are now illegible, sentenced to public hanging for incitement to rebellion. Their executions were staged as warnings, bodies left hanging at crossroads for days. Yet none of those names match the preacher's. His absence, his refusal to die on their terms, was the final defiance. What makes the story of 1863 remarkable is not merely the violence of the revolt, but the silence that followed it. The archives of the Confederacy are nearly mute on the subject, as if by denying it ink, they could deny it memory. Plantation account books from that year are filled with mundane entries: sugar yields, supply shortages, prices, but occasionally in the margins, one finds something more human. Jacob missing. Presumed drowned, or Sarah gone again, took the children. Each line is a ghost, a fragment of the great exodus that the preacher's fire had inspired. By the winter of that year, as frost gathered on the cypress roots and the riverboats froze in place, the bayou seemed peaceful again. Yet beneath the stillness, history was moving. The enslaved population, once atomized by fear, had begun to see itself as a people in motion. Some fled north to join the Union, others fled south into the swamps to build their own republics of survival. The old order, though still deadly, was crumbling, and somewhere within that shifting wilderness, or perhaps beyond it, the man who had lit the spark of rebellion became one with the landscape that had sheltered him. The landscape that had sheltered him. Those who claimed to have seen him in later years always described the same thing: a tall man with a scar above his eye, dressed in rags, walking barefoot along the levee. He never spoke of his name, but if asked where he was going, he would answer only, home. Some thought he was mad, others that he was a preacher still spreading the gospel of deliverance. None could prove he was the same man who had burned the plantations, and perhaps it no longer mattered. What mattered was the story, that once, in a place where resistance was said to be impossible, someone had stood up and set the world on fire, and the echoes of that act still lingered in the water and the wind. In the years that followed the preacher's disappearance, Louisiana became a landscape of haunted memory. The Civil War still raged through its parishes, reshaping everything: the plantations, the river economy, and the very idea of power. Yet beneath the roar of cannon fire and the clash of armies, there remained the quieter struggle of survival and meaning. For those who had witnessed the flames of 1863, the revolt was not merely a historical moment. It was a wound, a question, and a revelation that refused to fade. Even as the Confederate banners fell, the memory of that night when enslaved people struck back and vanished into the swamps continued to whisper through the cypress groves and along the levees where survivors built their new lives. When Union forces finally took full control of southern Louisiana in the spring of 1864, they found a region both liberated and broken. Plantations that had once fed the wealth of the Confederacy now lay half in ruins, their labor forces scattered. Many enslaved people who had not joined the preacher's band fled to Union lines, seeking safety in what were known as contraband camps, sprawling tent settlements that sprang up around New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Port Hudson. These camps were chaotic worlds of freedom and suffering, thousands of men, women, and children living amid disease, hunger, and uncertainty. Yet even in their misery, they were alive with a new sense of purpose. Union officers who entered the camps noted how some of the refugees carried stories from the bayous, tales of rebellion and resistance, of a preacher who had set the fire in La Fourche and walked into the water free. To many of these freedmen, his name, whatever it truly was, became a symbol of what they had survived. The oral record that grew from these refugee camps would later form one of the earliest threads of African American memory in Louisiana. It was here, around the flickering fires of Port Hudson and along the crowded docks of New Orleans, that elders told younger generations about the revolt. They spoke not of defeat but of deliverance, of men who had chosen freedom over life itself. They went into the swamp, one freedwoman recalled in an account recorded decades later, and the swamp kept them safe. The Lord sent them a road through the water. These recollections blurred fact and faith, yet they preserved something essential that written history could not: the conviction that rebellion, once begun, could never be entirely extinguished. The Union Army, for its part, saw in these men and women a potential force. By late 1863 and into 1864, the U.S. colored troops, regiments of formerly enslaved men, were forming across the South. In Louisiana, many recruits came from the same parishes that had burned during the preacher's uprising. Some officers believed they were fighting not only for the Union, but to avenge the wrongs done in those fields. The irony was heavy and cruel. Men who had once been hunted as fugitives now wore blue uniforms and marched under the American flag, fighting former masters who still called them property. Yet in their quiet determination, there was a continuity. The same courage that had driven the preacher's followers into the swamp now drove these soldiers into battle. Meanwhile, the planters who survived the rebellion and the war found themselves in a world they no longer recognized. The Emancipation Proclamation had stripped them of legal ownership, and the arrival of Union troops had stripped them of authority. Some fled to Texas or Cuba. Others remained, trying to rebuild under new labor contracts. But the power dynamics had changed irreversibly. The same men and women they had once whipped and bought now stood before them as free laborers demanding wages, and, more dangerously, respect. In parish records from 1865 and 1866, one finds dozens of disputes between freedmen and former masters. Many of these conflicts centered on back pay, food rations, or housing. But beneath them lay a deeper moral reckoning. The planter class could rebuild their houses and mills, but they could not rebuild the old fear. Something had broken in 1863, and no amount of law or violence could mend it. The preacher's name began to reappear in strange places during these years. Freedmen's Bureau agents stationed in Thibodaux and Houma recorded statements from former slaves who mentioned a man of God who had led them out from bondage but was taken by the water. One report from 1866 notes that freedmen still held secret gatherings in the woods, where they sang songs of deliverance and spoke of a leader who would come again. To white observers, these were dismissed as superstitions. But among black Louisianans, such rituals served a powerful function. They kept alive a lineage of defiance, a reminder that freedom had not been given but seized, and that its defense demanded eternal vigilance. The Reconstruction years were an age of both hope and betrayal. For a brief moment, the federal government promised land, education, and representation to the newly freed population. In Louisiana, schools for black children opened for the first time. Black churches flourished, serving as both spiritual and political centers. Former soldiers returned from the war with a sense of dignity that could not be undone. Yet the backlash was swift. By the early 1870s, white supremacist militias, the White League, the Knights of the White Camellia, began terrorizing freed communities, determined to restore the racial hierarchy by force. Night raids, lynchings, and arson became tools of intimidation. In this new climate of terror, the story of the preacher and the revolt resurfaced with renewed power. To black families living under the constant threat of violence, the tale of a man who had fought back, who had burned the symbol of slavery and disappeared beyond capture, offered both warning and hope. It was told in whispers in the cane fields, in hymns sung low during church services, and stories passed down at night to children who asked why their fathers were afraid to walk the roads after dark. "Because the world ain't forgot what we done," one elder told a Freedmen's Bureau interviewer in 1871. "They still looking for that man who burned the cane. They think every one of us got a bit of him in our hearts." That sentence, preserved in a faded transcript, captures the essence of what the revolt had become. No longer a single event, but a living metaphor for black resistance in the South. Historians of the late 19th and early 20th centuries largely ignored the preacher's uprising. The white scholars who shaped early narratives of the Civil War preferred to emphasize reconciliation between North and South, not the rebellion of those once enslaved. Plantation histories published during that era, be often written by the descendants of slaveholders, reduced slave revolts to disturbances or misunderstandings. Some even denied that such events occurred in Louisiana at all. Yet the oral memory persisted underground, passed through generations who carried the truth in their voices when the written record refused to. By the time the 20th century dawned, Louisiana's black population had been stripped again of political rights through Jim Crow laws, disenfranchisement, and violence. But even under that suffocating regime, the old songs and stories survived. Folklorists from the Works Progress Administration, collecting slave narratives in the 1930s, occasionally stumbled upon fragments of the preacher's legend. In one interview from Terrebonne Parish, an elderly man named Isaiah, born in 1845, described a revolt he had heard about when I was a little one. He spoke of a tall man who preached about Pharaoh and how the people set fire to the sugar house and run to the woods. When asked what became of them, Isaiah smiled and said, "They still out there, mister. You can hear them when the wind blow." The interviewer dismissed the story as fantasy, but Isaiah's words echoed the same belief that had sustained generations before him, that the spirit of rebellion could never be buried. Modern scholars, looking back, have begun to treat these stories with the seriousness they deserve. Recent research into maroon societies, slave resistance, and local archives has uncovered patterns that match the outlines of the preacher's revolt. Parish death records from 1863 show an unusual spike in fatalities labeled "unknown Negro," suggesting extrajudicial killings following the uprising. Military correspondence mentions disloyal elements in the bayous, while archaeological surveys of the Atchafalaya Basin have found traces of settlements that may correspond to maroon camps described in oral accounts. Piece by piece, history has begun to validate memory. Yet the true power of the preacher's story lies not in the evidence it leaves behind, but in what it represents. The unrecorded courage of those who dared to resist in a world built on terror. The swamps of Louisiana, once seen as places of darkness and death, became through this memory symbols of freedom, the last refuge where enslaved people could reclaim their humanity. Even today, in the stillness of those wetlands, there are locals who speak of ghost lights flickering above the water, or of voices rising like distant hymns. To historians, these are legends. To descendants of the enslaved, they are reminders. The past in Louisiana never truly dries out. It seeps through the ground, whispering the stories of those who would not die as slaves. By the time Reconstruction collapsed in the 1870s and federal troops withdrew, Louisiana's black population was forced once more into a shadowed existence. The gains of freedom were stripped away piece by piece, then the vote, the land, the schools, until what remained was endurance itself. Yet endurance, too, can be a form of rebellion. The preacher's fire had burned for only one night, but its light continued to travel through generations, illuminating the way for others who would rise in later years. The sharecroppers' strikes, the church movements, the songs of the Delta that carried the old grief and the old hope. History, like the river, does not forget where it has flowed. By the late 19th century, Louisiana was a state haunted by its own unspoken histories. The war had ended. Reconstruction had been strangled in its cradle, and the hope that freedom might blossom into equality was being steadily crushed beneath the machinery of Jim Crow. Yet beneath the surface of this new order, in the cabins along the bayous, in the humble chapels of freedmen's congregations, and in the whispered gatherings of elders at dusk, the story of the 1863 revolt refused to die. It persisted like an ember hidden beneath ash, waiting for air. Those who remembered the preacher spoke of him not merely as a man but as a sign, a figure who had walked the narrow line between flesh and legend. To the white record keepers of the era, his story was an inconvenient myth. To the descendants of the enslaved, it was sacred history, told not to entertain but to preserve the truth that someone had once fought back and had not been erased. In the decades following the collapse of Reconstruction, Louisiana became one of the most repressive corners of the post-war South. The rise of white supremacist organizations such as the White League and the Ku Klux Klan ensured that the promises of emancipation were systematically undone. Black schools were burned, black voters were driven from the polls, and those who dared to organize for their rights were lynched as examples. In this atmosphere of terror, public memory was policed as ruthlessly as political power. Newspapers, courts, and historians conspired in silence, rewriting the past so that slavery appeared benevolent, and rebellion, especially by slaves, vanished from the record altogether. But memory is not so easily tamed. It travels through song, through faith, through the private worlds that history books cannot enter. It was in the black churches of southern Louisiana that the preacher's story found its new home. By the 1880s, the independent black church had become the spiritual and cultural heart of freed communities. In small wooden chapels along the river, congregations gathered not only to worship but to teach their children, to discuss land disputes, and to dream of a future not governed by white hands. The preacher's tale entered these spaces as both a warning and a prayer. He was remembered as the man who called the fire, a phrase that appeared in old sermons and spirituals of the period. His revolt was retold as a kind of Exodus story, a local version of Moses leading his people out of bondage, except that his promised land was the swamp itself, the only place left where freedom could exist. The swamps, in this telling, became the landscape of salvation, the inverted heaven of the enslaved. Folklorists who traveled through Louisiana at the turn of the 20th century encountered fragments of this oral tradition. In 1904, an African-American preacher from Ascension Parish told a young white researcher that, "Our Moses ain't crossed the Red Sea, he crossed the bayou." Another man, a sugar mill worker from Iberia Parish, said that his grandmother used to sing of the preacher in the reeds, whose spirit still watches the fields when the cane grow high. These were not mere folk tales. They were acts of cultural preservation. In a time when the dominant society sought to erase every trace of black agency, the story of the revolt offered proof that resistance was possible, that dignity had survived even in bondage. In black communities across the South, such legends served as what historian Sterling Stuckey later called collective memory in motion. They were not frozen accounts of the past, but living narratives that evolved with the people who told them. The preacher's revolt became a flexible symbol. In one version, he was a prophet struck down by God. In another, he was a warrior taken into the earth to rise again. In yet another, he was simply the one who would not bow. Each retelling emphasized a different moral, reflecting the needs of the community at the time. During years of violent repression, his story was a lesson in endurance. During the stirrings of political awakening, it became a call to rise. Meanwhile, white Louisiana was crafting its own counter-history. The lost cause mythology took firm root in public monuments, school books, and commemorations, portraying the Confederacy as noble and slavery as a benign institution. In this version of history, slave uprisings were unthinkable, not because they had not happened, but because their acknowledgement would have shattered the illusion that enslaved people were content. Planter descendants published memoirs describing loyal servants who remained faithful even during the war. The preacher's revolt, if remembered at all, appeared only as rumor, a brief disturbance among the Negroes, swiftly suppressed by vigilant citizens. Yet beneath the veneer of these genteel lies, the descendants of the enslaved kept the true memory alive, hidden in plain sight. By the 1910s and 1920s, the Great Migration began pulling thousands of black Louisianans northward, to Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit. Among them traveled the old stories. In boarding houses and train cars, elders repeated tales of the preacher who had vanished into the swamp, of the night when the sugar fields glowed red and the sky carried the sound of chains breaking. These migrants carried the past as armor, a source of identity in the alien landscapes of the North. In church basements in Chicago's South Side, the story transformed again. The preacher became a forerunner of all black struggle, his swamp a metaphor for every place of exile and endurance. Folklore became heritage. Rebellion became lineage. In Louisiana itself, the swamps that had once harbored fugitives began to be drained and cut for lumber by northern companies. Towns expanded into the old maroon territories, and with each tree felled, another fragment of physical history was lost. Yet even as the land changed, the whispers remained. Locals spoke of the Preacher's Crossing, a stretch of bayou near Lafourche Parish said to be cursed, where compasses failed and the water never stilled. Hunters claimed to hear drums in the distance on windless nights, or to glimpse figures moving through mist. Whether these stories were born of superstition or collective memory, they testified to an enduring presence, the refusal of history to disappear quietly. During the Harlem Renaissance, Black intellectuals and artists began to rediscover the power of such suppressed histories. Writers like Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes traveled the South collecting folklore, reinterpreting oral traditions as sources of pride rather than shame. Though the Preacher's Revolt itself was never fully documented in their work, its spirit echoed through their efforts to reclaim Black history from the margins. The Revolt's themes, faith, resistance, exile, and rebirth, resonated with a generation searching for ancestral strength in the face of modern racism. In this cultural reawakening, the Preacher's legend stood as a ghostly ancestor of the new Black consciousness, a reminder that resistance was not invention, but inheritance. Through the first half of the 20th century, Louisiana remained a land of deep racial division. The sugar industry, rebuilt on the exploitation of Black and Creole laborers, preserved the hierarchies of the past under new names. Segregation defined every aspect of life, from schools to streetcars to cemeteries. Yet in these constrained worlds, cultural expression flourished. The blues and spirituals born of the Delta carried in their rhythms the same lament that had once filled the swamps, the sorrow of bondage and the yearning for deliverance. In some early field recordings from the 1930s, ethnomusicologists noted lyrics referencing the man in the bayou and fire in the cane. These may well have been distant echoes of the 1863 revolt, transmuted through generations into music that bridged memory and myth. As the civil rights movement emerged in the mid-20th century, historians and activists alike began to revisit forgotten episodes of Black resistance. Young scholars from Southern universities, inspired by the works of W.E.B. Du Bois and John Hope Franklin, began digging into parish archives, military correspondence, and oral histories. What they found often startled them. Buried in the records were hints of a coordinated slave uprising in southern Louisiana during the war years, brief mentions of disturbances, troop movements, and unexplained fires. Cross-referenced with oral accounts, these fragments began to form a pattern. While the preacher's name remained elusive, his actions, and the consequences that followed, were unmistakable. The revolt was real. It had happened. The silence had been the lie. By the 1960s, the descendants of those who had once been enslaved began to reclaim not only their civil rights, but their histories. Black educators in Louisiana incorporated local resistance stories into informal teaching circles, often outside the approval of white school boards. At community gatherings, elders would speak of our own Moses, who had fought long before Martin Luther King Jr., long before Malcolm X, a man who preached deliverance and vanished into freedom. In this way, the preacher became a bridge between eras, linking the spiritual rebellion of slavery to the political struggle of modern liberation. The swamp, once a site of escape, now symbolized the Black South itself, a place of danger and beauty, refuge and resistance. Yet for all the new research and pride, mystery remained the soul of the story. No grave was ever found, no definitive record uncovered. Every attempt to pinpoint his identity ended in speculation. Some claimed he had been a literate slave preacher named Gabriel from Lafourche Crossing. Others believed he was a runaway from Mississippi who had found refuge among Maroons. A few historians even suggested he might have been several men, a composite of uprisings condensed into one name through the workings of oral tradition. But to the communities who held his memory, the question of identity mattered less than the truth of what he represented. He was the embodiment of the unbroken will to be free. By the time the 20th century drew to a close, Louisiana had begun to reckon publicly with its buried past. Museums and historical societies started collecting testimonies about slavery and resistance. Archaeological teams ventured into the bayous, mapping sites once rumored to shelter Maroons. Some found traces of earthen mounds, fire pits, and tools that seemed to confirm the existence of hidden settlements. But even amid these discoveries, the preacher's presence remained spectral, glimpsed, never grasped. It was as if history itself resisted capture, echoing the man who had walked into the water and vanished. Through it all, the preacher's legacy endured not in monuments or archives, but in the living memory of his people. His revolt, born in fire and faith, had survived generations of silence. It lived in the songs and the prayers and the quiet defiance of those who refused to forget. And perhaps that was fitting. For revolts, like rivers, are not meant to end. They flow forward, reshaping the land long after the storm has passed. By the 1970s, the United States was in the midst of a turbulent reckoning with its own history. The civil rights victories of the previous decade had forced a confrontation not only with the nation's laws, but with its collective memory. In Louisiana, as across much of the South, the myth of the Old South was beginning to crack. University departments, newly integrating and influenced by the rise of Black Studies programs, began to reopen the questions that had long been sealed by local custom and racial silence. Among these questions was one that surfaced repeatedly in the archives: references to a disturbance among the Negroes near the lower Mississippi in 1863, and to missing records in parishes along the river. What had once been dismissed as rumor began to reappear in footnotes, field notes, and fragments of letters that spoke of something larger, an uprising, drowned in secrecy. It was in this intellectual climate that a young historian from Southern University named Dr. Lillian Dupree stumbled upon the first tangible clue. While cataloging Civil War-era correspondences in the Louisiana State Archives in Baton Rouge, she discovered a brittle packet of military reports from Union officers stationed near Donaldsonville. One letter, dated August 12, 1863, mentioned the dispersal of rebel slaves who had set upon their masters with fire and shotguns before escaping into the lowlands. The officer's tone was casual, even dismissive, but his reference was unmistakable. Dupree, who had grown up hearing her grandmother speak of the preacher who called the fire, recognized the story's cadence instantly. This was no isolated skirmish. It was the revolt whispered about for a century, the rebellion that history had erased. Her discovery sparked a small but determined wave of research. Scholars, activists, and community historians began tracing the movement of enslaved people across the parishes of Assumption, La Fourche, and St. James during the war years. They cross-checked plantation ledgers, church registries, and Freedmen's Bureau records, piecing together the silhouettes of men and women whose names had been written down only when they were bought or punished. The task was painstaking, hindered by deliberate destruction of records after emancipation. Many plantations had been burned by retreating Confederate troops, others sanitized by planters seeking to conceal evidence of disloyalty or rebellion. Yet the traces that survived, notations of runaway groups, mentions of Negro preachers stirring unrest, suggested that something significant had taken place. By 1975, Dupree published an article titled "Fire in the Cane, the Lost Revolt of 1863" in a small Louisiana historical journal. It was a cautious piece filled with caveats, but it broke the silence that had persisted for a century. She described how enslaved workers, emboldened by the Union Army's approach, had coordinated a local uprising led by a preacher who vanished after leading his followers into the swamps. The article drew little attention outside academic circles, but within Black Louisiana communities it reignited old memories. Elderly church members began coming forward with family stories, letters, and oral accounts that had never before been recorded. In one interview conducted by Dupree in 1977, a woman named Sarah Baptiste, then 83, said her grandmother had seen the man in white preaching by the bayou the week before the soldiers came. They say he was like a wind, she told Dupree, come and gone before the sun rose. Through the late 1970s and early 1980s, Dupree's students began conducting oral history projects across the parishes, recording dozens of testimonies that describe the revolt in vivid, sometimes contradictory detail. Some claimed the preacher's name was Noah, others said Elijah, but all agreed that he had preached deliverance and fire. These testimonies added human texture to what had been a ghostly trace in the archives. They described gatherings by torchlight, coded sermons woven from biblical language, and the eerie silence that followed the night of burning. One elderly man recounted how his grandfather, as a boy, had been told never to enter the swamp after dark because that's where the Lord took his soldiers. The accumulation of such memories began to reconstruct the event not as myth but as suppressed history. In 1984, a team of historians and archaeologists from Louisiana State University joined the effort. Funded by a small humanities grant, they began excavating portions of Bayou La Fourche near an area still known locally as the Crossing. What they found astonished even the skeptical. Buried beneath layers of sediment were remnants of burned wooden structures, posts charred and blackened, fragments of hand-forged shackles, and a cluster of musket balls dating to the early 1860s. A few yards away, they uncovered shards of pottery and animal bones, evidence of what might have been a small encampment. The findings were fragmentary, but they aligned precisely with the oral accounts: a fire, a flight, and a disappearance into the swamp. The discoveries drew cautious media attention. Local newspapers ran short features under titles like Historians Unearth Signs of Slave Uprising and Louisiana's Hidden Past, The Fire in the Cane Fields. Reactions were mixed. Some white residents dismissed the claims as exaggerated, insisting the fires had been accidental or the result of wartime chaos. Others, especially among the black population, embraced the revelations as long overdue recognition. Churches held commemorative services for the unknown 12, the small group said to have vanished with the preacher. For the first time, a community openly honored those whose defiance had been buried by fear and silence. Yet even as the story gained momentum, it remained fragile, vulnerable to distortion. Without a written manifesto or survivor testimony, skeptics argued the event could not be proven as organized revolt. Dupree and her peers countered that absence of evidence was itself evidence of erasure. The systemic destruction of slave narratives, they argued, had been a political act, an attempt to maintain the myth of passivity that underpinned white Southern identity. The silence was not proof of nothing. It was proof of control. This argument resonated with the growing field of subaltern studies and post-colonial theory, which sought to recover the voices history had deliberately silenced. By the late 1980s, the preacher's revolt began to enter popular consciousness. Documentary filmmakers, journalists, and musicians drew inspiration from the fragments. A New Orleans blues artist recorded a song titled "The Man in the Bayou," blending field hollers with modern rhythm, its chorus repeating, "He walked into the water and the fire walked behind." Black artists began using the preacher's story as a metaphor for resilience. In 1989, the Louisiana Black Heritage Festival hosted an exhibition called Fire in the Cane, Remembering the Rebellion, displaying archival documents,
oral history excerpts, and artwork inspired by the uprising.
The event was modest, but for many attendees it was the first time they had seen their local past represented as a story of agency rather than victimhood. The following decade saw a deepening of historical inquiry. Younger scholars expanded Dupree's groundwork, integrating her findings with broader studies of maroon societies and wartime resistance. The preacher's revolt was increasingly understood, not as an isolated act but as part of a continuum of black insurgency, stretching from the German Coast Rebellion of 1811 to the strikes and mutinies of black Union soldiers during the war. The swamps of Louisiana, long treated as peripheral to the main story of the Civil War, emerged as central theaters of self-emancipation. These marshes had been not merely hiding places, but front lines in a war for freedom fought on the edges of the visible world. In 1993, the Louisiana Historical Society, long dominated by white elites, finally acknowledged the 1863 uprising in a panel discussion on unrecorded resistance. It was a small but symbolic gesture, marking the first time official history admitted the existence of a revolt it had once denied. Dupree, then nearing retirement, attended the session. When asked why she had spent her life chasing a ghost, she replied simply, "Because ghosts are only what we make of the people we refuse to see." Her words, published in the local press, became a quiet motto for a new generation of historians determined to bring the hidden past to light. By the turn of the 21st century, the preacher's story had entered textbooks used in some Louisiana high schools, albeit briefly and cautiously. Teachers began framing it within larger discussions of slave resistance and cultural survival. Community reenactments, academic conferences, and even church plays revisited the event, though always with humility and reverence. Still, for every acknowledgement, there was pushback. Local critics argued that such stories reopened old wounds or exaggerated black militancy. But as the evidence mounted, letters, archaeological traces, oral testimony, the old denials lost their power. The preacher's revolt could no longer be dismissed as rumor. It had become a recognized chapter in the long, unfinished story of American freedom. As archives digitized and universities embraced oral history as legitimate evidence, the research deepened further. Historians began tracing the possible fates of the rebels who vanished into the swamps. Some suggested they may have joined maroon communities that had existed for generations in the Atchafalaya Basin, autonomous settlements of fugitives who lived by fishing, hunting, and trading with sympathetic Creoles and Native Americans. Others proposed that they were captured and executed without record, their bodies buried anonymously in the bayou mud. Each theory carried its own weight of tragedy and defiance. By the early 2000s, the preacher's revolt stood as both a local legend and a national symbol. Scholars cited it alongside Nat Turner's 1831 insurrection and the 1811 German Coast Rebellion as part of a lineage of resistance that challenged the myth of slave docility. What made the Louisiana story unique was not its scale but its survival, a testament to the endurance of oral culture in the face of historical amnesia. The preacher's fire had burned for a single night, but its light had traveled through generations, flickering across centuries of silence to reach the modern age. And so, more than 140 years after the uprising, the world was finally ready to see what the swamp had hidden, that freedom had always been fought for, not given, that those who disappeared into the marshes were not lost, but transformed into the living conscience of a people who refused to be forgotten. By the dawn of the 21st century, the preacher's revolt had crossed the fragile boundary between legend and recognized history. What had once been whispered among elders and encoded in songs now entered the formal archives of Louisiana's collective memory. The slow revolution of acknowledgement carried forward by scholars, descendants, and community leaders began to alter how the state understood its past. In small towns along the Mississippi, public history projects, museums, and memorial committees began to ask questions that had been taboo for generations. Who were the people who burned the cane fields in 1863? What had they hoped for? And what had their defiance meant for the world that followed? These questions no longer belonged only to historians. They belonged to a public ready at last to listen. In 2006, a major step occurred when the Louisiana State Museum launched a multi-year research initiative titled Voices of the River: The Hidden Histories of Slavery and Resistance. Among its exhibits was a dedicated section on the 1863 uprising, reconstructed through Lillian Dupree's papers, oral testimonies, and recent archaeological findings. Visitors encountered digital maps of the lower parishes, showing how the revolt had unfolded along the waterways that had once served as escape routes for fugitives. The display included a replica of a cane field torch, shackles recovered from Bayou Lafourche, and fragments of hymn lyrics that referenced the man in the reeds. The museum's curators made a deliberate choice. The exhibit did not seek to romanticize rebellion or erase its violence, but to humanize it, to present the uprising as an act of moral and spiritual clarity in a time of absolute oppression. The exhibit attracted tens of thousands of visitors in its first year. For some, it was an introduction to a part of Louisiana's history they had never been taught. For others, particularly black visitors from the parishes where the revolt had begun, it was a long-awaited validation. Church groups and family associations organized pilgrimages to the exhibit, many leaving handwritten notes in a book of remembrance at the entrance. We knew he was real, one visitor wrote beside her signature. Now the world knows too. The museum later digitized these letters, creating a living archive of collective testimony that extended beyond the display itself. In the academic world, the Preachers' Revolt began to attract a new generation of researchers exploring the intersections of history, memory, and identity. Graduate theses and scholarly articles examined not only the event, but the century-long process of its erasure and recovery. The concept of archival silence, a term used by historians like Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, became central to understanding how the revolt had been buried. The Louisiana uprising exemplified what Trouillot had called the unthinkable in Western historiography, events so threatening to dominant power structures that they were excluded from the narrative of the possible. The Preachers' Rebellion, scholars argued, had been unthinkable precisely because it contradicted the myth of passive servitude that underpinned Southern self-image. By restoring it to the record, modern historians were not merely adding a footnote to history, they were challenging the structure of history itself. Simultaneously, artists and filmmakers began interpreting the revolt for wider audiences. In 2010, an independent filmmaker from New Orleans, Marcus Leclerc, released a documentary titled Into the Swamp, the Fire, and the Faith of 1863. Combining historical commentary with dramatized reenactments, the film presented the preacher's story through the lens of spiritual resistance. It juxtaposed interviews with historians and local residents against images of the bayou at dawn, the mist curling over water that seemed to conceal its own secrets. The film's closing scene showed a torch floating downstream, an image meant to symbolize both the extinguished revolt and its enduring light. Premiered at regional film festivals and later broadcast on public television, the documentary helped bring the story to audiences far beyond Louisiana. The community response to the film was profound. Screenings often ended with open discussions, where elders shared family memories, historians clarified facts, and young people asked questions about what freedom had meant in an age of enslavement. Many of these gatherings took place in churches, echoing the same spiritual spaces where the preacher's words had once stirred the enslaved to courage. Through these conversations, the story of the revolt became less an artifact of the past and more a mirror for the present, a reminder that the pursuit of freedom is never finished. Meanwhile, grassroots organizations began advocating for official recognition of the revolt site as a state historic landmark. In 2013, on the 150th anniversary of the uprising, the Louisiana Office of Cultural Development convened a memorial event at Bayou Lafourche. The ceremony was simple but solemn, a procession through the sugar fields, prayers led by local pastors, and the unveiling of a small plaque reading, "In memory of those who rose for freedom, 1863. The names of the preacher and the 12 who followed him were still unknown, but the inscription carried their collective spirit. Descendants of enslaved families from the surrounding parishes attended, many bringing soil from their home places to scatter near the bayou's edge. For them, the act was not only historical recognition, it was spiritual closure. The event marked a turning point. From that year onward, local schools began including the revolt in their Black History Month curricula. Community museums curated traveling exhibits for rural audiences, and the preacher's story entered Louisiana's official tourism materials as part of the state's Freedom Trails Heritage Initiative. Yet this newfound visibility also provoked controversy. Some white residents complained that the commemoration reopened wounds or painted the past in bitterness. Editorials in small-town newspapers debated whether celebrating a slave revolt constituted revisionism, but such opposition only underscored how potent the story remained. A reminder that historical truth is not neutral, and that acknowledging resistance threatens those who built power upon forgetting. As the 21st century advanced, technology transformed how the revolt's history was preserved. Digital archives began hosting the scanned letters, oral transcripts, and photographs that earlier generations had fought to save. The Louisiana Digital Library, in partnership with historically Black colleges and universities, launched an online repository titled Rebellion and Redemption: Louisiana's Untold Stories of Freedom. Among its most visited entries was the 1863 uprising, presented through interactive maps, annotated timelines, and reconstructed plantation rosters, High school students and amateur genealogists could now trace their ancestry through these databases, discovering connections once lost to time. Some even identified potential links to families who had lived near the sites of the revolt, a discovery that carried immense emotional weight. In 2018, a landmark study published in the Journal of Southern History synthesized decades of scattered research into the first comprehensive account of the revolt. Authored by historian Dr. Camille Jean-Baptiste, the work combined demographic data, field archaeology, and oral traditions to argue that the preachers' uprising represented the last large-scale act of collective resistance in Louisiana before full emancipation. Jean-Baptiste's conclusion was both academic and moral. In the silence of the swamps, the enslaved proclaimed their humanity not with petitions but with fire. Her words echoed through classrooms and lectures across the South, reshaping how educators approach the Civil War's social history. Beyond academia, the preachers' revolt began influencing cultural identity in Louisiana in more subtle ways. Artists incorporated its imagery into murals, poets invoked it in verses about resilience, and musicians wove its themes into jazz and gospel compositions. At the annual New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival, a stage installation titled The Fire in the Swamp honored the story with a blend of spoken word and traditional percussion, linking the rebellion's defiant rhythm to the heartbeat of modern Black creativity. What had once been suppressed as rebellion was now celebrated as heritage, not an act of vengeance, but of vision. Yet the deeper meaning of the revolt continued to provoke reflection among historians and theologians alike. Scholars debated the moral dimensions of violent resistance, asking whether acts of fire and retribution could coexist with the Christian faith that had sustained so many enslaved people. Others countered that the preacher's actions were a fulfillment, not a contradiction of faith, that his invocation of divine justice against slavery was consistent with biblical liberation narratives. In symposiums and classroom discussions, the uprising became a prism through which to examine not only the past, but the ethical boundaries of freedom struggles across history. In 2021, the preacher's story reached another milestone when a Louisiana public university announced the establishment of the Center for the Study of Slave Resistance and Maroon History. Located near Thibodaux, within miles of the revolt's original geography, the center was dedicated to documenting Maroon communities, slave revolts, and the cultural ecology of resistance. Its opening ceremony included descendants of enslaved families, local officials, and scholars from across the country. Dr. Dupree's surviving family attended, carrying a small urn of bayou water, symbolic of both burial and rebirth. In her posthumous honor, the center's library was named after her, ensuring that the woman who had first followed the preacher's ghost into the archives would remain. Part of the story she helped resurrect. The center's early projects focused on education and public engagement. It hosted oral history workshops, guided tours of former plantation sites, and digital storytelling initiatives allowing young Louisianans to record family memories about slavery and freedom. These projects bridged the gap between academic research and community ownership of history. They also confronted difficult truths, not only the violence of the past but the inequities that persisted in its shadow. In towns where sugar still dominated the economy, many laborers descended from the same communities that had once toiled in bondage. For them, remembering the preacher's revolt was not abstract. It was a meditation on survival, dignity, and unfinished justice. Over time, the revolt story came to embody something larger than itself. It became a lens through which Louisiana confronted its intertwined legacies of oppression and resilience. The preacher's disappearance into the swamps symbolized more than escape. It represented the enduring refusal of history's oppressed to be contained. Every generation that rediscovered his story transformed it anew. From whispered legend to documented history, from silence to song. The fire that once burned the cane fields had become a light guiding scholarship, art, and memory. And yet, even in the age of recognition, the preacher's identity remained elusive. Despite genetic genealogy projects and archival digitization, no definitive record of his name had surfaced. Some found this frustrating. Others saw in it a kind of poetic justice. His anonymity, they argued, was his final victory. Proof that he belonged not to any one family or parish, but to all who had ever struggled to be free. His disappearance ensured that no monument could fully contain him. No narrative could close over his defiance. As one historian observed at a memorial symposium in 2022, he is the voice that echoes when we ask who we are, and the silence that answers when we forget. The story that began in the burning fields of 1863 had traveled nearly 2 centuries to reach this point of understanding. Through generations of erasure, rediscovery, and remembrance, it had evolved from an act of defiance into a moral compass for a state, and perhaps a nation, still wrestling with the meaning of freedom. The preacher who vanished into the swamp had not vanished at all. He had become history's conscience, surfacing whenever the living dared to look beneath the water's calm surface.